Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I usually have the pleasure of welcoming the audience to Gresham College and also introducing the speaker as Provost of the College. So I'll do the first, but not bother to introduce myself. You are very welcome here. Can I just note that on your seats, I think you've got reference to a lecture by the Lord Mayor, the President of the College, in the Mansion House, and there are still some seats available for that if anybody is interested. You do need reservations for that. I'm going to talk this evening about the hidden face of British gardening. Some of the great gardens of the past, such as Cork Abbey and Belvoir Castle, incorporate a curious feature. It's a tunnel, and its purpose was to conceal from the view of the owner and his guests, the servants and others who actually created and maintained and serviced the house and garden. Those, the gardeners that I'm going to refer to today, were, as Rudyard Kipling later put it in his poem The Glory of the Garden, the gardeners, the men and prentice boys, told off to do as they are bid and do it without noise. Kipling realized in this poem what the tunnels were meant to conceal. Our England is a garden that is full of stately views, of borders, beds and shrubberies, and lawns and avenues, with statues on the terraces and peacocks strutting by. But the glory of the garden lies in more than meets the eye. Our England is a garden, and such gardens are not made by singing, "Oh, how beautiful," and sitting in the shade, while better men than we go out and start their working lives at grubbing weeds from gravel paths with broken dinner knives. But it's not only the gardeners who are largely hidden from view in the history of British gardening. Among the thousands of books and the hundreds of periodicals devoted to gardening, remarkably few have considered the many different trades, crafts and industries which for many centuries have underpinned the British obsession or addiction with gardens. In this lecture, I'm going to report on the early stages of a research project into the economic history of gardening, which many people find a bizarre topic, and I'm going to try and suggest to you that it's interesting and possibly significant. And I'm going to, therefore, look at the growth of what I will call the garden industry. It includes large and small gardens, allotments, gadgets, garden centres, this is in random order, TV programmes devoted to gardening, books and periodicals, the makers of tools, of statuary, of garden machinery, pots and tubs, the seedsmen, nurserymen, and even the makers of garden gnomes, of which this is a rare Victorian example. I will exclude market gardening specifically for the market, and concentrate on gardening for pleasure and personal consumption and the industry which makes it possible. It's difficult to know when to begin because there were elaborate gardens in Roman Britain. Probably, although this of course is a reconstruction, but I presume archaeologically good reconstruction. And probably, though there's no trace of them remaining, much smaller gardens in the towns of Roman Britain. There were certainly many small gardens in the Italian provincial city of Pompeii, which of course we think of as an amazing large city, but was actually by Roman standards quite a small place. Equivalent to some towns in England. So there were probably gardens in Roman Britain, in England, across the country, and we don't know really what happened immediately afterwards, but certainly by the High Middle Ages there were monastery gardens across medieval Europe, which are recorded. They were mainly intended to supply medicinal herbs as well as fruit and vegetables, but they certainly, I imagine, gave pleasure to those who tended them and can be part of our story. And one has the famous plan of the monastery of St. Gall. In Tudor and Stuart times, by Tudor and Stuart times, we find manuals of gardening and evidence of the existence of nurserymen and the sale of plants and seeds. But I'm not going to talk about what I've talked about so far, but rather arbitrarily to concentrate on the last 350 years. Since the restoration of Charles II, Charles returned from exile in France enthusiastic about gardens, as were to be many of his successors. So I'll consider the last 350 years, but actually begin at the end with gardening as it is today. Look first at the gardening and the garden industry, then at the growth of the industry since 1660, the nurseries, the plants that they sold and the prices that they charged for those plants. I'll look at the impact of the plant discoveries of the 18th and 19th centuries on the supply and availability and prices of plants. And I'll look at the effects of the development of towns and the town gardens of the 19th century. And along the way, I'll try to assess the size of the garden industry at different times. And finally, I'll assess the potential for further research and invite you to suggest avenues for further research. So first, the gardening and the garden industry today. How much is the garden industry worth today? How big is it? The Horticultural Trades Association, which represents garden centres and nurseries, estimates our annual expenditure on gardens as £5 billion, mostly spent in places like this. It's a sizable sum, but it's actually only about 0.25% of our current gross domestic product. So it might seem that this is not a very large industry, not of much interest to economists. But like much of British gardening, what's on the surface is deceptive, and I want to try to look beneath the surface. David Cameron has recently told us that the GDP is a defective measure because it doesn't measure our happiness. But there is, of course, a more fundamental problem with GDP. It is that it doesn't measure a great deal of what we do, but only what we sell. In the 1930s, when economists were devising GDP as a measure, one of them pointed out, it's slightly quaintly phrased today, that if he were to marry his housekeeper, GDP would fall. That's because GDP includes the wages paid to servants, but not the value of the work of a wife. But of course, gardens do incorporate a lot of activity, and that's what I'm going to look at. They're a perfect example, in fact, of what economists call household production. Goods and services produced within the household and never offered for sale. And therefore, the work done on an allotment, for example, doesn't appear in GDP. But it nevertheless takes up a great deal of our time and occupies a great deal of our countryside. It provides many of us with fruit, vegetables and flowers. It also gives us a great deal of pleasure. How can we measure all this? First, we can use what are called time use studies, which have been attracting a considerable amount of interest among economists in recent years. These tell us how much time we spend on different activities, both at work and play, and therefore reveal much about our preferences, our likes and our dislikes. There are many time use studies in Britain, in the rest of Europe and in the United States, and the most recent British time use study in 2005 showed that on average the British adult spends 17 minutes per day on, the category is a composite one, on repairs and gardening. They're put together because it is observed that we tend to do repairs in the winter and garden in the summer. So we're probably saying that during the growing season, if I can put it that way, the average British adult spends 17 minutes per day on gardening. That may not seem much, but it's more time than the average British adult spends on formal education. In 2005, although it may not be true today, it was more time than the average British adult spent on using computers. And it was almost as much time as the average British adult spent on looking after children. So it's a significant use of our time. That may seem an obvious statement, but it's interesting to quantify it. Gardening differs in a number of ways from the other activities that I've mentioned. First, we tend to do more of it as we get older. The average 15 to 24-year-old spends 3 minutes per day on gardening. The average over 64-year-old, like myself, spends about 28 minutes, which of course is 3.5 hours a week. We also do more of it as we grow richer. People in social class A spend on average 3 hours a week in the garden. In social class E, the lowest social class, 2 hours a week during the main growing season. And of course the rich also spend more on paid gardeners. Now, all this time is not valueless, even if it's not counted in GDP. We speak of spending time on something, implying that time has a value. And we can assess the value of that time in terms which economists call opportunity cost, perhaps by assessing what we would otherwise earn in those hours. If we weren't wasting our time doing gardening, we're actually earning money and contributing to the economy, or what we would need to pay someone else to do the garden for us. On perfectly realistic assumptions, because the average British adult spends the time that I've suggested on gardening, the value of our time spent on gardening in a year is a minimum of £84 billion. That's if we value our time at the national minimum wage, which is significantly less, of course, than the average wage. And if one does a similar calculation on the basis of the cost of a paid gardener, if we paid someone else to do all this gardening, the figure is £270 billion a year. So that's the first aspect of the economic impact of gardening. But that's not all. Gardens use land, and land has value. If you look at any large-scale map of any British village, town or city, you'll see just how much land we devote to gardens. An impeccable source, Autumn Watch on BBC Two, estimates that gardens take up 2% of the UK land surface, or 1,481 square miles. Another estimate made by the Horticultural Trades Association fits quite well with that. It's of 1,300 square miles in England and Wales. And once again, we can estimate the value of this land by imagining that it was used in alternative ways. Perhaps as farmland, which much of it, of course, has been, or perhaps as residential building land, as perhaps the people keen to get rid of planning controls would like it to be. If it were to be the latter, if we were to value all our gardens as if they were residential building land, and they are in a sense close to residences, the capital value of our gardens would be a staggering £750 billion. However, we actually want, if we're to produce figures which compare with these, we need something like the annualized value of that capital. And if one takes it conservatively at 3% of capital, 3%, then we get a figure, an annual figure of somewhere between 200 million on the basis of valuing it as agricultural land and 23 billion on the basis of valuing it as as residential building land. But the gardening is more than that. It's more than the labour and land. It's also the other forms of capital which are employed in and the annual cost of the gardening equipment and seeds and so on. And for that we can add the £5 billion estimate from the Horticultural Trades Association, which I mentioned earlier. And at the moment I have no figure for this at all. A substantial amount on tools, books, gnomes, TV programs, magazines, etc. The result, on a very cautious basis, is therefore a huge figure, dwarfing the £5 billion which enters into gross domestic product. So I hope I've persuaded you that this is something worth taking seriously by economists. How did we get to this point? The story of the garden industry actually begins not very far from here. The earliest nurseries and seed businesses which we know about were in and around the City of London. London had the greatest concentration of wealth and also the best transport links. Information on these early nurseries in London and in the provinces were collected by a man called John Harvey, now dead, who's, as far as I can tell, the only garden historian to have shown any interest in the economic history of gardening. And I've found his books most valuable. The first large London nursery that we know about was the great Whitechapel nursery of Captain Leonard Girl. Those of you who know the Brick Lane area, now of course the great centre of Bangla Town and the so-called Indian restaurants, this is on the left-hand side, the Brick Lane itself. The green line at the bottom is the Whitechapel Road, isn't it? So running from Aldgate East out of London. So you're dealing here with about a 12-acre site. It was established by 1643, but it grew in importance after the Restoration of 1660. Harvey says rightly that it was not really large by later standards, but it did cover 12 acres to the east of Brick Lane. Its original speciality was fruit trees, but by the 1670s it also sold a range of hardy plants such as jasmine and lilac. The reputation of the nursery was cemented by the appointment of Girl in 1679 as gardener to Charles II and keeper of the Royal Gardens. He succeeded John Rose, seen here in a well-known painting presenting the first pineapple grown in Britain to his royal master. Unfortunately, we don't have a similar picture of girl. We know about Girls' Nursery and a number of other nurseries, initially around London, but increasingly during the 18th century in provincial towns and cities. They were on a large scale and grew rapidly. One of the most famous was the Brompton Park Nursery, founded in 1681. By 1685, it was able to supply the Earl of Bedford at Woburn with a single order of 200 apple trees, 50 pears, 100 currants, 100 gooseberries, peaches, nectarines, and mulberries, clearly already operating on a large scale. By the 1730s, the Were Harvey estimates 25 nurseries and seedsmen in London, clustered in fact in Hackney and Shoreditch on the one hand, and to the west around Kensington and Brompton area at the time. And important firms in Colchester, Exeter, Newark-upon-Trent, Oxford, Pontefract and York. By 1760 there were at least 30 large nurserymen and seedsmen in London and another 40 in the provinces. And there was a discussion at that point of extending membership of the Gardeners' Company of the City of London, which had been founded in the previous century, to cover all these nurseries, provincial nurseries. Didn't actually happen, but there was an estimate of how many there were. These nurseries were large in scale. Girls' Nursery, as I said, was 12 acres, but the typical area of acreage of nurseries around London was 30 to 60 acres. One of them was over 100 acres, and the provincial nurseries were even bigger. And their scale of operation must have been very substantial. One of the indications is that from the early 18th century they begin to produce priced catalogues of the kind which we're now all very familiar with. But they gave prices for a whole range of plants and for sale, of course, but particularly if we look at the prices of the trees, the forest trees which they were supplying, the minimum order for which they gave a price was 1,000 trees. Now, the growth of nurseries continued into the 19th century and beyond. But the evidence I've just described is that the garden industry was well established, even mature, before the traditional age of the Industrial Revolution. And not many other British industries can claim as much as that. Industries grow if enterprise fulfills demand. What were the major factors in demand and supply which made the growth of the garden industry so fast and so great? Let me look first at the prices of plants which were supplied and purchased. Some of these prices were collected, some of the prices I'm going to rely on were collected by Harvey, but for the 19th century onwards, I've used, slightly laboriously, but with great pleasure in a sense, catalogues preserved by the invaluable Lindley Library of the Royal Horticultural Society, who have been most helpful. These prices give us a sense of what gardeners wanted, what they were prepared to pay for, and what nurserymen could supply. There's no doubt that at the top end of the market, aristocratic gardeners, of whom there were many, were desperate for the latest novelty, anxious to steal a march on their gardening rivals. Here's a list of the most expensive plants which our sources tell us were sold in each half century from 1650 to 1900. I've quoted the year, the place of the nursery concerned, the plant, and I'll come back to those in a minute, the price at the time, the nominal price, and the real price in 2009 values. And I've also given you the price as a percentage of average annual gross domestic product at the time, which gives you a sense of how purchasing these plants would have impacted on the average family budget. The first of these plants was the nectarine, bred by Captain Leonard Girl in Whitechapel. Crossword addicts may recognize that El Rouge is E girl backwards. And this is nectarine El Rouge. I'll come back in a minute to the second and by far the most expensive plant, but they go on to the two trees listed in 1750 to 1799, which were both introductions from North America. Kalmia latifolia and Magnolia virginiana. Magnolia virginiana was the swamp magnolia, was the first magnolia tree to arrive in England, perhaps as early as 1688. But it was still described as rare in Miller's Dictionary of Plants in 1739. Kalmia latifolia, the mountain laurel, was introduced in 1734 by John Bartram and Peter Collinson, whose trade is described so well in a fascinating book, Andrea Wolf's book, The Brother Gardeners, which is about the plant trade, in particular from the Americas to Britain in the 18th century. It was very difficult to raise from seed in Britain, so many specimens came from America as saplings. And there's a whole history about the development of the technology which allowed plants to be transported across the Atlantic and later from other parts of the world. Price catalogues from the early 19th century are scarce because of the dispersal of the Royal Horticultural Society library in the middle of the 19th century. So we pick up the story again with peaches, nectarines and apricots, which I won't mention, I don't need to say very much about. And then in 1850 to 1899, Larix kempferi and Castanea chrysophylla. The Larix kempferi exemplifies the new trend of that period, which is the importation of plants from East Asia. It comes from northern and central Japan. Castanea chrysophylla is more of a puzzle because it doesn't appear in modern gardening manuals, but it seems to have been a sweet chestnut. Well, it is a sweet chestnut, but it seems to have come from North America. Now let me go back to the most expensive tree of all, the tulip tree of the first half of the 18th century, whose value today would be close to £3,000. That's the tulip tree, a splendid specimen of the tulip tree in Kew Gardens. But the tulip tree that I'm interested in was supplied by Robert Ferber in 1734 for the garden of Carlton House, the London residence of Frederick, Prince of Wales. Nothing remains of Frederick's garden except for the rather boring gardens of the Pall Mall clubs behind the Athenaeum and the Reform, and now backing onto the Royal Society building. But Carlton House Garden was designed for Frederick, Prince of Wales by William Kent, and it was described at the time by Sir Thomas Robinson as exemplifying a new taste in gardening. It has the appearance of beautiful nature, and without being told, one would imagine art had no part in the finishing. So successful was the Carlton House Garden, and so influential Frederick, Prince of Wales, that it was soon imitated. As Robinson again puts it, the celebrated gardens of Claremont, Chiswick and Stowe are now full of labourers to modernize the expensive works finished in them. Because, of course, in a number of these cases, they'd already had a garden makeover, and this is the next one. they're so full of labourers to modernise the expensive works finished in them, even since everyone's memory. If this grows a fashion, and it certainly did, 'twill be happy for that class of the people, as they will run no risk of having time on their hands. Kent went on soon afterwards to design the beautiful garden at Gresham near Oxford, the best example that still survives of mid-18th century fashion in garden design. But back to Carlton House. Frederick, like other princes of Wales, was not only enthusiastic and knowledgeable about gardening, but also impatient. And to the modern observer, one of the most extraordinary aspects of Carlton House Garden, which covered 9 acres along Pall Mall, as it is now, is that it was created in not much more than 2 years by the importation of many mature trees, of which the tulip tree was one and the most expensive. The tulip tree was accompanied by mature cypresses, by Virginia walnuts, catalpas, and many others, including a number of recent introductions from the Americas. Altogether, in 2 years, 1734-35, at least 12,000 trees and more than 2,000 border or climbing shrubs were planted. There were 1,500 elms, 400 cherries, 1,400 hornbeams, 1,000 chestnuts, 500 yews, 150 firs, hollies, oaks, laurels, lilacs, and many others, together with hundreds of herbaceous plants and thousands of bulbs. And these are all set out in the garden accounts. The garden accounts show expenditure on plants in 2 years of the equivalent of £450,000 in today's prices. But there were also, on top of that, fountains. There was turf for the lawns. There were pebbles, gravels, stone, dung, mould. There were 2 engines for watering with 654 feet of leather forcing pipes. There was an octagon with statues and a bathhouse. So a really substantial piece of engineering, as well as of the garden industry. Frederick was also, of course, with his wife Augusta, Princess of Wales, the original creator of the gardens at Kew, which were to become the Royal Botanic Gardens. And the sadness of this story is that it was at Kew, directing the planting in 1750, that Frederick caught the severe chill from which he died in March 1751, aged only 44. He's probably the only heir to the throne so far to die from gardening, but he's certainly not the only one to take delight in his garden. Now, to return to more mundane matters, what I would argue is that it's a sign of the capacity, the large scale of the garden industry in the mid-18th century, that so many plants could be supplied in just 2 years, principally by 2 nurseries. The scale of the industry then and in the 19th century is suggested also by the speed with which new plants were introduced and the fact that prices fell as more specimens were bred for a mass market. As the market grew, nurseries seem to have been able to capture and to pass on to their customers economies of scale. But plant rearing has always been, and continues of course to be, a very labour-intensive industry, with labour costs having a major effect on prices. Now, most of the plants that were sold were of course much cheaper than the extremes I've been discussing. This table shows the median price of plants that we know about. Obviously we don't know about most of them. The median price of plants sold in each decade. The median, to remind you, being the price for which half the plants are cheaper and half more expensive. what this table suggests is that prices fell in the later 18th and early 19th centuries, and then rose again towards the end of the century. And I've done a different study of a number of plants which are comparable. Part of the problem with doing this work is that not untypical in economic history, is that the thing you're measuring keeps changing. And of course, the range of plants available in the 1890s is extraordinarily different, really, from the range of plants available in the 1730s or earlier. But if you try to control for that problem by looking at plants which, by and large, which have been important in this country and by and large haven't changed, or at least not obviously, and look at the forest trees, I've looked at the prices of ash, beech, birch, chestnut, elm, Scotch and silver fir, hazel, holly, hornbeam, larch, laurel, lime, oak, poplar, sycamore, walnut and yew, all of which are supplied by nurseries throughout this period. In all these cases, real prices again fell significantly between the mid to late 18th century and the early 19th century, to about a third of their previous value. So this suggests strongly that this is a growing and maturing industry which is able to capture the economies of scale available, but it also must be operating on a very substantial scale. And I'll come back to that in a minute. These prices then persisted, these lower prices persisted, at least for the forest trees, somewhat longer than is shown on this table, into the late 19th century, but then rose again in the 20th century to levels which are significantly higher, often higher than they were over 2 centuries ago. Who was buying all these plants, the thousands and upon thousands of plants which are recorded and implied in the catalogues? The short answer is we don't know. The records of the Carlton House Garden are exceptional, although I hope in future to have many happy days touring Britain and its great gardens and recording information about the purchases of those gardens. But we will never know how many plants were bought by the owners of medium to small gardens. The tradition, of course, is that many plants were traded or exchanged, or seed was kept for the following year. And this was almost certainly true of the archetypal English cottage garden with its vegetable plot. But if I pass to what happened, and that archetypal English cottage garden must have been the predominant small garden of the 17th and 18th centuries. The gardens of the gentry in the great estates are well documented, but probably don't tell the whole story at all. The extent of village gardens can clearly be seen in large-scale maps from the early 19th century and before. If I take the village that I now live in, Haddenham, you can see from this large-scale map around the time of enclosure that there are a substantial part of the village is gardens. Houses are a relatively small part of the area of the village. It's the gardens that predominate. And that must have been true of villages, small towns throughout the country. But of course, there were and had been large gardens in towns. Sir Thomas Gresham's house, familiar to anybody who comes to Gresham College, because we use this picture in many ways. Sir Thomas Gresham's house in Bishopsgate has this large garden, there are other pictures which show more trees arrayed in pots round apparently in pots round the garden, but we can imagine that there were large areas devoted to gardens even in the big towns. Now, of course, during the 18th and 19th centuries, in this and many other countries, the majority of the population have come to live in towns and cities. And what's surprising is that gardens and the demand for garden produce didn't reduce or disappear when this occurred in Britain in the 19th century. The reverse was true, with new town gardens being established, which seem to have been, although more research is needed, a British peculiarity, differentiating us from many other European countries. What's the evidence for this growth in demand in the 19th century? The 19th century was actually the great age of gardening books and magazines, the equivalent of today's Gardener's World and Gardener's Question Time, or the garden makeover programs. During the 19th century, nurseries multiplied, their catalogues grew larger and larger, running to hundreds of pages, many more than today. We have nursery catalogues from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, for example, from Hilliers and other familiar names in garden history and nurserymen, which sell several times more plants than are available in the equivalent catalogues today. The range of plants, with the North American plants supplemented by introductions from India, China, Japan, South Africa and South America and Australia, multiplied to levels not seen before or since. Now, it seems inescapable that much of the demand for these plants must have originated in towns and their suburbs. Of course, the country gardens continued, and of course, the British middle classes did create some fabulous gardens at the end of the 19th century. But the majority must have been of demand for plants, the majority of gardens must have been in small town gardens and their suburbs. And the great puzzle of British, particularly English garden history, is why the gardening tradition carried over from the countryside to the towns, and why the new houses built in their millions in brick and stone terraces almost all had gardens attached and used a lot of land for the purpose. In some cases, building regulations stipulated that houses must have gardens, but elsewhere builders clearly responded to demand. Gardens in towns were ubiquitous. A Cambridge PhD student, Zoe Crisp, who I'm glad to see here, is doing some very interesting work at the moment, studying the urban back garden in the long 19th century. She's already shown that most of the houses built in the growing towns of the 19th century did provide for a yard or garden. There were exceptions, which have received, of course, a lot of publicity for good reasons, such as the infamous back-to-back housing of some northern cities, but these were unusual and transient. Zoe shows that in Sheffield, Preston and Northampton, the three towns that she's studied so far, the majority of houses had gardens of at least 20 square metres. Imagine 5 steps by 5, or at least my steps, 5 by 5. This is quite small, but it was clearly sufficient to grow some plants and vegetables. In addition, we know that there was a substantial trade in window boxes and, of course, house plants, of which the ubiquitous Victorian aspidistra is the best known. It could tolerate, at least as well as its owners could, the smoke pollution which hung over most cities and was certainly the bane of urban gardeners. We know from other sources that urban gardening was popular throughout the country. One excellent source, which I hope to use, is the records of numerous local horticultural societies, together with the reports which appear in just all the time in every town and city newspaper, with the reports of shows, sometimes vegetables, sometimes flowers, sometimes of particular plants, such as the auricula, the ferns or the orchids, which all experienced waves of popularity and emulation in the 19th century. We also know, and this is actually a topic that has been studied quite well, of the growth and immense popularity of the allotments, which were established after a time by Acts of Parliament from the late 18th century onwards in England's towns and villages. I made use earlier of data on the size of gardens, and these can be used to calculate that the average size of our gardens today is about 130 square metres. Gardens in 19th century towns were much smaller than this. Zoe's data shows that the average garden in Northampton in the 19th century was over 40 metres squared, and in Preston about 20 square metres. As today, she suggests the size of gardens varied with social class. The average working class garden in Northampton being about 30 square metres, and the average for the upper middle classes being about 60 square metres, with a similar variation in Preston. Now, if one uses those figures are probably, because we know that, as I've suggested, in the villages in particular in England, gardens were much larger than that. These figures are probably a minimum, much lower than the national average, but they can still be used to extrapolate to the whole country in order to try to estimate how much land was devoted to gardens. This was, at the minimum, 15 to 20,000 hectares at the end of the 19th century, but probably much, much more. It's over 300,000 hectares today. So we have the indication from land use in the 19th century that it was really a substantial expansion of the garden industry. We don't have time use evidence for the 19th century. But men and women in the past probably devoted just as much time to gardening as we do today. They didn't, of course, have so many of the tools which, at least in theory, reduce our labour in gardens today. And this was, of course, certainly the belief, or possibly the hope, of those who advocated the provision of allotments, which would enable men to provide food for their families and at the same time keep them out of the pub. But as today, gardening, I think, gave pleasure to people of all sorts and conditions. Well, I've not had time in this preliminary lecture to look at many parts of the garden industry, at the tool makers, the makers of flower pots, the authors of gardening books, the publishers of gardening magazines. There's also much more to be said about the gardeners and the fearsome head gardeners of Victorian fiction, and P.G. Wodehouse in particular. I would welcome your suggestions, therefore, for the most fruitful areas of research and your thoughts on the British peculiarity which I've been discussing. How does one explain the great conundrum, the flowering of large and small town gardens, devoting large areas of our country to this pastime? Why are we willing, as a nation, to spend so much time and money on gardens? How has an aristocratic craze become a national obsession? I look forward to your questions and your thoughts. Thank you. And we do have 10 minutes or so before drinks, so I would welcome your questions and your thoughts. Yes.
When you put up one of the slides earlier on giving the most expensive plants of a particular period, one of the categories was peaches, nectarines and apricots. I would imagine that the price that you quoted, or prices that you quoted, were associated with specific cultivars rather than just an unnamed plant? Or an unnamed fruit?
In some, yes. I think you're right, yes.
I wonder then whether your research, either current or future, will have anything to say about what appears to have been quite a clear demise in fruit hybridizers in this country in the last 70, 80 years probably. I wonder whether it's an economic thing or whether it is the increase in the public sector with much apple and pear cherry breeding being done by the research stations, although they too have gone now, or most of them, many of them, or whether it is a financial thing. I mean, you take a company like Laxton's, and they were phenomenal in their time for about probably 40 years or something. Thank you.
The simple answer is I don't know, but I agree it's an interesting area to speculate on. The origins of hybridizing are also quite interesting because of the theological problem which was presented. In the early 18th century, it was, of course, believed that the creation had been a fixed event. And therefore, a number of the early plant breeders and hybridizers had severe theological doubts about whether they should be doing what they were doing and producing new plants, which by definition were not created at the time of the creation by God. So there is a debate in the which affected the Royal Society, actually, in the early 18th century about whether people should be undertaking this activity. But as you're suggesting, they certainly did, and it became a very big industry, yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Without getting into GM, I come to Gresham because I want to learn things, and by golly, I've learned a lot this evening, so thank you very much. You asked for comments, well that's it, and you asked for suggestions about further research. Towards the end of your talk, Professor Flood, you moved very much more towards the British examples, and I'd like to tease out a bit more, in a sense, how you can say it was a British obsession rather than not, because, for example, not market gardening to produce cash crops, but many other countries call their gardens, in fact, their subsistence, especially in countries with lower per capita GDP than ours. Does this fit into your research anywhere?
Well, I'm tempted to say that doing the economic history of English gardening is probably enough for my retirement, and spreading to the whole of Europe would be a bit much. But I think the interesting thing, I've just actually come back from Lithuania, and was discussing with people from different European countries at the meeting that I was attending, you know, the effect, the growth of gardening in those countries. And it does, I mean, clearly, if you go to France now, you see a substantial number of garden centres, but they are very much a creation, I stand to be corrected, but I would have thought of the last 20 or 30 years, that it really wasn't a French obsession, despite the importance to garden history of Versailles and other areas. It wasn't a French obsession in the way that it appears to have been for England during the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. Of course, people throughout Europe and indeed in the United States have gardened for vegetables, for subsistence. But I think the interesting thing about England is that so much of what we know about garden history suggests that it was decorative plants, flowers. I mean, there was a huge growth of the floristry industry, but as I suggested, you have these local societies devoted to different forms of floristry, as it was called. So it appears to be simply a much bigger activity, a much more important part of life in this country than it is in, possibly not in the Netherlands, possibly maybe some growth in Belgium, but certainly in most other European countries. Of course, the Italian gardens have their own history, but again, I don't think that it really extends to the middle and working classes in the way that it does in this country.
Could it be something to do with why we didn't have a French Revolution when the French did? In other words, I mean, a sort of conventional view of 18th century history is that our gentry nobility stayed closer to their villages and to the people who were doing the work on these estates. And it was catching. And I suspect fashion also comes into it. And I suspect, to really answer your conundrum thing, you'd have to look at furniture and all sorts of, habits of eating and the way in which things spread from the toffs to the rest of us.
Yes, I mean, indeed, I think, it seems to me that you can argue that the reason why we didn't have a French Revolution was not because we were spending all our time in gardens, but because we were richer. And one of the signs of being richer in the 18th century is indeed the substantial expansion of various forms of consumer goods. This is a topic which has really become of great importance in economic history in recent years. There used to be all our effort was, so to speak, concentrated on industrial development. But in the last 20 years, there's been a substantial amount of work on consumer goods, as you say, furniture, clothing, jewellery, all kinds of different forms of consumer goods, which seem to expand, as I'm suggesting gardens did in the earlier part of the 18th century, before the classical period of the Industrial Revolution. So I think you're quite right that situating it within that economic development is probably a sensible thing to do. The conundrum, I think, really is why it continued. I mean, you can understand why it grows in the 18th century, but as I say, why did we devote so much of this relatively expensive land in the 19th century to gardens? Frank.
I don't know when people started visiting, the ordinary people started visiting the big houses and gardens.
Very early on.
Very early. And is there any evidence that people visiting these houses and gardens thought, I'll have a bit of that myself, and that would generate the gardens that we see today?
Yes, I mean, you mean literally that they pinch bits of the plants and yes, probably. As Cynthia will not like me for telling this story, but when she was an undergraduate at Oxford, when we were, she remembers her mother surreptitiously touring the Oxford Botanic Gardens, snipping bits off plants, and how horrified she was by this activity. So I'm sure that that's been going on for a long time. I mean, the garden visiting was, I won't say as big an activity as it is today, but certainly a very big activity indeed, and that one therefore has, from the 18th century onwards, lots of accounts of gardens, and it was clear that people were delighted to show them off, so to speak. So it's and some of the big nurseries that are developed in the 19th century become major tourist attractions, not just Kew, but some of the commercial nurseries in London. There are accounts of visiting royalty being taken to commercial nurseries in London in the 19th century. So the tourism, garden tourism, is a big activity again, which I haven't had a chance to really work on.
The advancement of encouraging gardening in small townhouses must surely be due to affluence. 100 years ago, people couldn't spend any spare money on flowers and trees. Any ground they had, they just used for growing food.
No, I don't think that's true with respect. I mean, if you read the accounts of, let's take a very poor area, the East End of London in the 19th century, many of those accounts mention the plants that people had, and those weren't for food, they were for decoration. So I think that there's a lot of evidence, and of course many of I referred to the horticultural shows and the competitions that took place in the auriculas and orchids and ferns and so on. Those many of those were very much working class competitions. They were patronized and in some cases encouraged. There's a whole history of middle and upper class encouragement of gardening through the presentation of prizes at these shows. It was something that took place in this country and in Ireland. But the impetus very much clearly comes from the working class population of the country, and it wasn't just for food.
But these days, the power of advertising. People have money, they can just jump in their cars, drive out to a nursery, and come back loaded with the stuff.
Yes, they can. But I think it's interesting that Columbia Road Market in the East End develops at the end of the 19th century. It wasn't, I mean, I had hoped that there would be some connection with the nurseries that had been there 200 or 300 years before, 200 years before, but there doesn't seem to have been. But the market, which is still very active, of course, for fruit and for flowers and flowering plants, seems to have developed at the end of the 19th century again in quite a poor working class area. It had a economic utility because the retailers of Covent Garden could try and offload the plants that they'd failed to sell at Covent Garden during the week onto the East End at the weekend. But it's quite clear that there was a substantial working class activity of pleasure gardening.
May I make another point, please? In a future lecture, I'm sure you'll be going into gadgetry.
Yeah.
What we need is a successor to Dyson. He made his name on vacuum cleaners. There must be somebody out there who can introduce gadgetry that's noiseless.
No, I certainly would want to go into the technology of gardening, if I can put it that way. There's a fascinating plate which shows the tools that John Evelyn used in his garden in the 17th century. So that garden tools, again, clearly had become a substantial trade by that period. And of course, you then have the history of the invention of the lawnmower in the early part of the 19th century, and then the whole history of garden tools, mechanical tools as they've developed. And great ingenuity was shown, and I agree this is a subject well worth studying. I think one more question perhaps, and then right up the back, and then we'd better go out for a drink.
Thank you. I wonder about the effects of people like Robert Owen and New Lanark and the Bournevilles and Cadburys on social housing. And also, as suburbia spread, there are many tree-lined streets, and I can think of one nursery that must have been thousands upon thousands of trees, and some of them must be getting on for 100 years old now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly the history of the promotion of gardening for a social purpose is an old one. I mean, the original allotment movement begins at the end of the 18th century, has strong Christian evangelical roots, as well as aristocratic patronage. And then, as you suggest, the new towns, some of the industrial towns, and then the garden cities of the late 19th century are all examples of the deliberate encouragement of gardening. But I think they are, in a sense, the tip of the iceberg, that the range of domestic gardens in normal towns, if I can put it that way, was really the bulk of the activity.
And always need somewhere to dry the washing.
Yes, No, obviously you did need gardens for other purposes, and we have in our garden in Haddenham, as those of you who were kind enough to come and visit us will know, a thatched privy from the late 17th century, and the privy, the use of the garden for that purpose was probably significant. But, and certainly I mentioned the building regulations which required gardens. I think that the impetus behind many of those was actually to provide open space and air for the houses, as well as to, but they did then provide for the ability of people to grow a few plants. Well, thank you all very much. There are drinks outside or in the headmaster's study.
Sorry,
Yeah.
normally the Provost thanks the Speaker. He obviously can't do it tonight. On behalf of all of us, as Tez Quirk said, we've learned something. We've not only learned a lot, but we've learned it in a most enjoyable way. So we're going to go away, I think, thinking all sorts of interesting things, and possibly digging old catalogues out of our lots and that kind of thing, looking at old instruments, and regarding gardening in a very, very different way. So thank you very much, Provost, for a superb talk.